Weekly preaching can be a grind because one of the things I learned early in my ministry, perhaps the second, third week, Sunday comes every 7 days. I would preach on Sunday. I would take Monday off. Tuesday I'd come in, I'd do some work, think about, man, I got to preach again on Sunday. Wednesday would come. Thursday, panic would set in. I need to have a sermon finished. And I did that for perhaps, a couple months, where I would scramble, put together a sermon, and they may or may not tie into last week's sermon or what's coming up next. And I found that that was a very difficult, non-sustainable way to approach ministry. My name is Ken Hensley. I'm a pastor and coach. I'm the founder of Senior Pastor Boot Camp. And one of the things I am passionate about is helping pastors, especially senior pastors, be healthy, be effective, and to be able to serve God for the long run. When I was that young pastor scrambling to figure out what to preach, I hadn't learned the value of planning. And as I've grown in my, not just ministry, but my awareness of preaching and the power of preaching, I have become a big proponent of planning. One of the things that has served me well over the years is to learn to plan in advance. When I first started planning, that might be planning a month at a time, maybe a few months at a time. Maybe I planned 6 months at a time. And then somewhere about 20 some years ago, I began developing the idea of a preaching calendar, 12 months. And I would set aside time in the fall. I would pray, go away for some quiet time, devotional thinking. And I would look at what have we preached on most recently, the last year or 2 years. Where does God want us to go as a church? What's the vision that God has for this church? And then how will preaching help shape that conversation, help move us in the path towards that? And I began planning out my sermons a year in advance. I didn't write them a year in advance. But I could tell you come probably October, November, here's going to be the series in January, February, March. Here's the big idea for the series. Here's each individual weekend. And most often, it had a scripture attached to it. And if we were preaching through a book, that made it easier. If we were doing a topical series, I would always root it in 1 or 2 passages. But I began developing the rhythm of planning. Once I did that, it was amazing how things began to fall into place. Even when I planned 2-3 months in advance, I knew I was going to be preaching on something in 3 months. I would hear something. I would read something. I was like, oh, I'm going to be preaching on that. And I'd write it down. I'd create a folder. I'd drop it in a Word document. And I was able to do my research throughout the year. And then when it came time to actually do that week, a couple of weeks out, I would dive a little bit deeper. But planning is one of your best friends when it comes to sermon preparation. The other thing that I discovered is developing an outline or a template that I use for pretty much every sermon. Now, you might have been raised or trained in a generation or with perhaps a mentor. You have your introduction, your 3 points in a poem, and then your conclusion. I did that for several years. And then I read a wonderful book by Andy Stanley about communicating for change. And in that, he shares his sermon outline, his skeleton, that he uses for most every sermon. And I adopted that. I thought, this is great. I can use this, makes sense to me. And that is the basic building blocks of a sermon that I still use to this day. Perhaps read that book in 2005 or 2006. But regardless if you use Andy Stanley's method or somebody else's method in terms of outlining, develop an outline or a template system that works for you, that you know is going to help you understand the material, follow it, stay on track, communicate well, and then use that template. Use that template as you build your sermon, as you write your sermon outline, and you will find that things then begin to click. It's like muscle memory, and things get a little better. The final tip has to do with guarding your Friday or Saturday, or both. My first church, a couple of churches, we just had Sunday-only services. When I served in Denver for 13 years, we had Friday night and we had Saturday night and Sunday services. And then for a period of time, we had Thursday night, Saturday night, and Sunday. And so we were pretty much preaching all the time, it felt like. But even then, what you need to do is make sure you have at least a day or so before you're preaching your sermon for the first time, where you just let it sit. You're finished. You put all your you've wrapped it up, Put your bow on it. It's good to go. You can look at it, perhaps revisit it, but don't be rewriting it, doing, researching it. Try to have a time where you can just let it sit, where you can just reflect on it, do other things, be with your family, spend time out, taking a walk, do those kinds of things. But don't be working on it right up until the last minute. When we planted our church in San Diego back in 2004, 2005, after a couple of years, I became bivocational. As some folks would say, I was a tent maker, which meant I worked a day job. And that day job took about 50-some hours to do. And then I'm a father, a husband, I'm a pastor, a church planter, as much as possible outside of my day job. And I found myself the only time I had to give devoted, significant time to sermon prep was Saturday. And there was nothing like it. Because Saturday, after all of our activities, girls softball, things that we did throughout the day, I would start working mid-afternoon, work into the evening at dinner, and I knew Sunday morning was coming. And I had to bring that puppy together because it's coming out of the oven one way or the other come Sunday morning. Fortunately, I had been preaching for about 15 years by that point. If I'd just been starting, if it had been brand new, those same sermons, they'd have been dangerous. They'd have had warning labels on them. These are going to be awful sermons. But because I'd already developed good habits, I was able to do that. But let me tell you about my stress level. It was off the charts. One of the best things you can do, develop a good rhythm, set time to do reading and writing, have a plan for your preaching so you know where you're headed, but then protect that time right before you preach. So that when you do come in to preach, when you stand before your church and before your congregation, you're ready. I hope you found this material helpful. Perhaps you've developed your own rhythms along the way, things you've learned about preaching that's helped you. I would love to hear what those are. You can drop those down in the comments. As I mentioned each week, if you click like and subscribe, that helps us out with YouTube as people search for helpful material on how to be a better senior pastor, and we would greatly appreciate that. So until next time, preach well.